So we got diverted previously, we had to stop. So we're back on Thursday, 19th of November. And if you remember where we got to, you got to the wedding of your mother and your father in Limerick. And then we had diverted to talking about your grandfather's trip to Scotland.
Oh, true, very true. Well, I said already, I think, that he had walked into Galway from Moycullen and had got a job in as a grocer's assistant. I don't know how long he had, but anyway, he formed a friendship with another young fellow called John Burke, and the two of them decided to go to Glasgow to further their careers. John Burke worked in a shipping company, and Martin Maloney is a grocer. So anyway, they went off to Glasgow, where there was a lot of contact at that time between the west of Ireland and Scotland, led principally by Derry and followed by Sligo and Galway. So he got himself a job with a grocer and publican in Glasgow. And John Burke got himself a job with a shipping company. Now, I don't know how long they were there, probably 3, 4, 5, 6 years maybe, because to achieve a sort of apprenticeship in these trades. And during the time they were there, they usually lived in the house of the person to whom they were apprenticed. Glasgow at the time was a thriving city, growing greatly in industrial production, particularly of shipping. And the Irish were quite prominent in it. They had to fight every step of the way because there was a lot of racial antagonism towards them. But as I said, there was a lot of contact between the west of Ireland and Scotland at the time, mostly in the terms of the potato trade. But there was always a coastal trade in shipping goods back and forth between the west of Ireland and Scotland.
And that would have gone all the way down to Galway, you think? It wouldn't have just have been in the north in Donegal?
No, it was all the way down, yes.
And
anyway,
but did he go by ship, you think, to Glasgow, or did he walk?
I would think he went by ship.
You think
yes.
he went by ship?
Yes, I would think so.
And when he went, I wonder, was it a big... Because he was a grocer's assistant at that point already, and he went to Glasgow to become a grocer's assistant again.
Yes, I'd say he was probably a bit higher up the tree.
Was he?
When in Glasgow, you know, I don't know what he was doing in Galway. He might have was riding a bicycle around delivering goods.
Yes. So you think the move moved him up?
I think the move probably moved him up, yes, to a full-fledged apprenticeship.
They weren't organised apprenticeship, was it? There wasn't a guild or anything like that, no?
As far as I'm aware, there wasn't. There wasn't a guild. But there was the custom, because he himself did it later on for his cousin, the Whelans, Michael Whelan. And the Whelan boy lived in Lombard Street with him, because he's in the 1911 census as living in some versions it's number 3 Lombard Street, and in other versions it's number 45.
Right.
So I don't know what the number actually was.
And there's no chance one was the house and the other was the shop?
I wouldn't think so, because they were both the same in the same premises.
Right.
And the premises was quite large. Aside altogether from the house, which was a 3-story house, there was a big long yard at the back which contained storehouses, and it went right down to the canal which ran along at the back of that section of Lombard Street.
And you saw it, but you don't remember the address. Is that true?
I saw what?
The house. Like you're describing the house, so you saw the
yes.
house, but you just don't remember what the number of the street was. Is that right?
I never asked him what the number of the street was, and as I said, the 2 versions I've seen written down as to what was the number. So I'm not sure.
And of course that portion of the gone now, isn't it? In fact, so you can't check it at all.
No.
The numbering system doesn't apply anymore. Is that right?
Probably not, because the site of this Shambles Barracks, which was on the corner at the beginning of Lombard Street, and then the house started, and all that is now taken up by the school, including the site of the Maloney House.
Which school is that?
Oh, I don't know. I don't know the name of it. I should know, because
is it opposite the church? Is that is it? Am I right in thinking that?
Well, it's more. The Maloney House was more opposite the church than the previous, the earlier houses on Lombard Street. The school now is nearly opposite the church. A bit of it is. The bit that was the Maloney House is right opposite the church. And I was going to say something about it there. No, it's gone.
He went to Glasgow anyway, and you think they stayed there for 5 or 6 years?
I do, yeah, I do. Now, I've no real basis for that, except just sort of instinct, you know, because these apprentices terms were quite long.
Yes.
So I'd say he probably stayed there, something like that.
You didn't make money though as apprentice, did you?
No.
So when he came back, if he came back after the apprenticeship, he would have come back without money?
He would have come back without money, or with very little.
So how then did you set up in Lombard Street?
Well, that was achieved through his marriage to Agnes Dooley. Because her brother had been the administrator of Rahoon Parish, Moses Church Rahoon, which was directly in as the bishop's assistant. The bishop was the real parish priest of Rahoon, and he was there as the administrator. And because of that, there was and the fact that his other sister was in the Presentation Convent. Whether she was Reverend Mother now, at what stage she became Reverend Mother, I don't know, but she did eventually anyway. There was a very strong connection between the Dooleys and the church. And you see, that was evidenced later on when Agnes Dooley was a widow, and when she gifted the house and the site to the bishop for nothing, as far as I know, on the understanding that the cathedral would be built on the site which is now occupied by the school. I remember what I was going to tell you about the school. I was having my feet done by a chiropodist in Cleary's lately, and the young man who was doing it, in the course of our conversation, told me he was from Galway, and he had actually attended school.
Really?
But I never asked him the name of it, which I should have done.
Well, if you look at the gift that Agnes Dooley gave of that premises to the church,
Yes.
and we go back and think more about your father, would you think that was a blow from his point of view, or from the point of view of any of the children, That was in effect denying them their inheritance in a way, wasn't
Yes, it was.
it? And I know there was a good few of them, wasn't there?
Well, there was Joe, who was the doctor, and I think the girl, Pauline, would have been dead, I think, by then. She died at 19 from some form of bone tuberculosis, I understand.
Mm.
And there was my father, Patrick, and his brother, John, and his sister, Jenny. Now, at some time around 1920, Jenny married a British officer and went off to live in London. And the officer, whose name was Coles,
How do you spell that?
OLES, he wasn't much good, and they had to be supported by the father. And the father bought her a house in Croydon, and that's where they lived. What the income was, I don't know, but it wasn't much.
Mm.
I think he was only part of in the wartime army. I don't think he was in the standard army.
Yeah. So he might have had a very small pension from it, but it wouldn't have been substantial.
He might have had a very small pension.
Do you know his full name as a matter of interest?
Pardon?
Do you know his full name?
His full name? No. I've heard it, but I can't recall it at the moment. No.
So you had at least one aunt who could have done with the money, and I suppose the doctor might have been better off.
Yeah, he was a bit better off, yes.
Your father was, I suppose at this stage, when are we talking about the 1930s now, are we?
Yes.
I suppose your father was reasonably well established at this stage?
He was sufficient then. He was a manager in Dunmore
Yeah.
at that stage. When his father died in 1932, and we're talking about the years subsequent to that.
Subsequent to that.
Now the plan had been, of course, that the business would go to John.
John.
But when John came back from the war, having been in the American Army, because his father and mother were afraid that he was going to get conscripted into the British Army, which was very much on the cards at the time.
Yes.
So they sent him off to his relations in New York. And what did this so-and-so do? But he turned around and joined the American Army. Because I suppose he wanted a bit of adventure and go. And the very first group of American soldiers, before the main group arrived in France, he was in that. So he was in France from the very beginning. And he was in the trenches. He survived in the trenches because he presented me much later on with a periscope that they used to use in the trenches so that they could see what was happening in no man's land without putting their up
Yes.
and getting shot by a sniper. So he gave me this periscope, and it still had the mud of France on it. And
When did he give you that?
sometime around 1940, I suppose.
That's extraordinary.
But he barely survived the life in the trenches. I mean, the life in the trenches was dreadful, even for the Americans, who were better equipped than any of the others.
Mm.
Because when he came back to Galway, having been discharged from the American Army, his health was so bad that his father sent him down to Terard, where he wanted to rent him a little house, a little shack really, that was there on the river where the river enters. And the man who owned the nearby land and who claimed this island out in the middle of the river but actually I'd say he had very little title to it at all, if any. He was either a relation or a friend of the people who had been evicted from their lands and whose cause had been taken up by Father John Dooley, John Maloney's uncle. So he said to him, oh, if you're Father John Dooley's nephew, there's no rent. Just go and do whatever you want to. So it was good and bad. It was good in that John could occupy the thing straight away, but it was bad in that he had no title to it, because he was going to leave it to me much later on. But when he died, there was nothing to leave. So it never happened. I mean, as far as I was concerned, it never happened. Now, it didn't worry me because a little shack on an island in the middle of the river, Uachtarard River, was of very little use to me. I couldn't do anything with it, really.
Yes.
You'd have to live there.
Yes. It wasn't much of a life. I wonder why going to Uachtarard was any good for him. Maybe it was his mental health rather than his physical health that was delicate.
Possibly. And it took him away from his friends in Galway, who were bad for him, because John was really an alcoholic.
Right.
Now, whether he was an alcoholic at this stage or not, I don't know, but I suspect that he probably was. And the father got him away from his pals in Galway and sent him down to Uachtarard, where he had nothing to occupy him fishing on the lake whenever he felt the need for something to do. Otherwise he didn't do anything.
It's a pretty miserable life.
A pretty miserable life, but it was looked upon as kind of therapeutic.
You knew him well, obviously.
John?
Yeah.
Oh, John very well, yes. Because, you see, we used to go as a family, as PJ's family, we used to go to Galway quite often in the summertime. And we used to stay with Minnie Laffey, who lived in the house that Agnes Dooley, my father's mother, had built when she vacated the premises in Lombard Street. She bought this piece of land down by the canal and she built this house on it for herself and for Minnie, who was looking after her. Minnie had qualified as some kind of a much earlier on in the story. Now, what kind of a nurse she was and how much medical knowledge she had, I don't know, but she could look after her aunt, who was my father's mother. And
what was that house? As a matter of interest, do you know?
The address of it, I never saw. Kappa Villa, it's called. It has a name.
Kappa Villa.
Kappa, C-A-P-P-A.
Do you think it still exists?
V-I-L-L-A. Oh yes, it's there, flourishing, occupied. But a very cold house. Oh crikey.
Is it a big house?
But they used to live virtually on only one room, well, 2 rooms. They 2 bedrooms and the kitchen. They didn't live really in any of the rest of the house. It was furnished all right and Minnie kept it clean, but they never lived in it really.
Was it a substantial house then?
Oh yeah, so it was a substantial 2-story house. I imagine it was probably built of stone. Perhaps that was maybe the reason why it was so cold.
And whereabouts is it now? Describe where it is.
Oh yes. Well, you go out over the Salmon Weir Bridge and you bear right then along, this is the main road. It used to be called College Road, but I think it's called University Road now.
Right.
And you walk along there until you come to the canal. The canal used to have a bridge that lifted
Mm-hmm.
because there was quite a lot of traffic on the canal coming from Lough Corrib. But now the bridge over is permanent. And there's a walk down along on the banks of the canal. The left-hand side of the canal, which is the side that you come across first as you walk down the road, there's a turn into the right off it, and there are, I think it's 2 houses built there on the canal bank. And Minnie Laffey's house was the second of the 2. There was a family called Hines that lived in the first one. Who lives in it now, I don't know.
Mm.
But Kitty has investigated it and has talked to the man who's now living, the family who are now
Right.
living in it. When Minnie Laffey died, her nephew, Eamon Laffey, who had had a job in McCambridge's in Galway, he inherited the house from Minnie, and he sold it for £4,000 at the time, which would have been in I have John's death certificate upstairs actually, because he died very soon after Minnie. 60s. No, no, I'm stuck. My father died in 64. I think John died in 67. And it was around then anyway, Eamon Laffey inherited the house and he sold it, and he went off to live in Mullingar, where he had a grocer's shop himself, because his wife was from Mullingar. I think she had been a nurse in the hospital in Galway. I think that's where he met her. And they lived on in Mullingar, and as far as I know, the family still live in Mullingar. 13 Chestnut Street is their address.
Let's take a break there because I want to change the tape.
Right.